In the year 1700, Istanbul was so crowded that even silence felt rare, and the sheer number of lives pressed together inside its walls created a tension that never truly faded, day or night. This was the heart of an empire stretching across continents, yet for ordinary people, greatness felt less like power and more like pressure, because every street, market, and home overflowed with humanity. What makes this moment unsettling is that Istanbul did not feel on the verge of collapse, but rather on the edge of suffocation as millions learned to survive within a city that had grown beyond comfort or control. People woke each morning surrounded by noise, bodies, and expectation, knowing that space itself was a luxury few could afford. The city appeared stable, even magnificent, but beneath its grandeur lay a daily struggle to move, work, breathe, and exist without being swallowed by the crowd. For ordinary residents, daily life unfolded within an environment shaped by constant proximity and rigid hierarchy, where every action took place under watchful eyes. Homes were packed tightly together, often housing extended families within limited space, while narrow streets carried an endless flow of traders, soldiers, animals, and laborers. Privacy was scarce, and personal life blended seamlessly into public existence, forcing people to develop patience and restraint as tools for survival. Work depended on navigating congestion, whether hauling goods through packed markets or waiting hours for access to resources shared by thousands. Disease spread easily in such conditions, and while outbreaks were feared, they were also accepted as part of life in a city where distance was impossible. Istanbul's people learned to endure crowding not as inconvenience, but as a defining feature of existence. Despite these pressures, the city functioned through an intricate balance of routine, tradition, and adaptation, allowing millions to coexist within limited space. Markets operated with remarkable order, guided by custom rather than force, while neighborhoods formed tight social bonds that helped regulate behavior and resolve conflict. Faith provided structure and comfort, offering moments of calm within overwhelming density, and rituals helped people mark time in a place where days could blur together. Istanbul's greatness depended not only on imperial authority, but on the quiet discipline of ordinary people who learned how to share space without constant conflict. Life inside the world's most crowded empire was not defined by ease or comfort, but by endurance, as individuals adapted their expectations and habits to survive within a city that demanded constant compromise. As the city expanded outward and upward, the pressure of crowding shaped not only physical movement, but emotional behavior, teaching people how to live close without constant confrontation. Residents learned unspoken rules about space, timing, and restraint, knowing when to speak, when to yield, and when to disappear into the flow of the city. Water sources, bakeries, and public baths became points of both necessity and tension because access had to be shared among countless users each day. Waiting was a part of life, as was negotiation, and patience became a survival skill rather than a virtue. Children grew up surrounded by strangers, developing awareness early, learning how to read expressions and intentions in an environment where misunderstanding could quickly escalate. Istanbul's density demanded social intelligence, rewarding those who adapted and overwhelming those who did not. Yet within this constant closeness, moments of order and beauty persisted, offering relief from the strain of endless movement and noise. Religious spaces provided quiet not just for worship, but for mental rest, while communal traditions reinforced shared identity across differences of language, origin, and class. Food, music, and storytelling allowed people to connect beyond necessity, transforming crowding into community, even if only temporarily.
The empire's diversity intensified the city's complexity, layering cultures and customs into a shared rhythm that required cooperation to function. Istanbul survived its own scale because its people learned to coexist through habit rather than idealism, adjusting expectations to reality. Life inside the world's most crowded empire was never simple or comfortable, but it endured through a collective understanding that survival depended on balance, tolerance, and the quiet acceptance of limits imposed by living too close to escape. As years passed, the weight of Istanbul's population influenced how power, labor, and opportunity were distributed across the city, often in ways invisible to those at the center of authority. The closer one lived to trade routes, ports, or administrative districts, the greater the competition for resources, work, and security, forcing ordinary people to constantly reposition themselves within the urban landscape. Movement itself became strategic, with families choosing where to live based not on preference, but on access and survival. Fires, a constant threat in tightly packed neighborhoods, could erase entire communities in hours, yet rebuilding followed quickly, driven by necessity rather than optimism. Loss was frequent, but so was recovery, because leaving the city entirely was rarely an option for those whose livelihoods depended on its density. Istanbul taught its residents that stability was temporary and that adaptation mattered more than permanence. Even under these conditions, the city maintained a sense of continuity that allowed life to progress across generations. Apprenticeships, family trades, and neighborhood roles passed quietly from parent to child, reinforcing structure within chaos. Authority existed, but daily order relied heavily on custom and mutual understanding, because formal control could not reach every corner of such a vast population. This reliance on informal systems fostered resilience, but also required constant negotiation, patience, and restraint. Istanbul in 1700 did not thrive because it was easy to live in, but because its people learned to endure proximity without surrendering to conflict. Within the crowded heart of an empire, survival was not achieved by space or comfort, but by discipline, adaptation, and an unspoken agreement to coexist within limits few could escape. As the rhythms of life continued within Istanbul's crowded boundaries, the city's density began to shape how people imagined their future, narrowing dreams while strengthening resolve. Advancement rarely meant escape, but improvement within the same tight spaces, a better trade, a more reliable connection, or a slightly safer street. Ordinary people measured success not by wealth alone, but by stability, by the ability to feed a family, maintain reputation, and avoid disaster in a city where misfortune traveled quickly. Crowding sharpened awareness of hierarchy, yet also revealed its limits, because survival often depended more on cooperation than status. Neighbors relied on each other during illness, fire, or shortage, understanding that isolation was dangerous in a place where help had to come from nearby. The city's scale forced people into relationships they did not choose, yet those relationships became the foundation of endurance. By the early 18th century, Istanbul stood as a testament to human adaptability, a city sustained not by space or comfort, but by shared tolerance and routine. Its crowded streets carried generations of memory, each layer of population adding experience rather than relief. What history often overlooks is that the empire's strength rested not only on armies or administration, but on millions of ordinary lives navigating congestion with restraint and patience. Istanbul in 1700 was not simply crowded, it was sustained by a shared understanding that survival depended on balance, tolerance, and the quiet acceptance of limits imposed by living too close to escape. As the decades moved forward, Istanbul's immense population continued to reshape the city in subtle ways, teaching its people how to exist within pressure without expecting relief. Overcrowding became so normal that emptiness itself felt unsettling, and quiet spaces were treated as temporary rather than desirable. Ordinary people learned to interpret the city's moods through sound and movement, sensing trouble through changes in noise, flow, or absence rather than through official warnings. Conflict, when it arose, was usually contained through negotiation and custom because open confrontation threatened the fragile balance that allowed millions to coexist. The city's survival depended on restraint practiced daily by those who understood that disorder could spread faster than authority could contain it. In this environment, endurance was not heroic or dramatic, but habitual, woven into routines passed down without question. By the early